I'm Seth Cooper, an agent for mostly European artists and mostly early music ensembles. Um, the topic today, I guess, is how to organize a tour in the U.S. And we're going to go into some of the real nuts and bolts of the details involved. And I think before a tour begins, we could talk just briefly about confirming a tour, making a contract, and what goes on in the preliminary stages. The first thing, of course, is the asking fee. And in general, I find that the asking fees, the artists' fees from foreign groups, are usually high compared to what the market in the U.S. Can accommodate. In general, a fee per artist of about $1,000 is probably about the maximum amount that's going to work. Once you start with a fee of $1,000, the expenses involve the travel, the visa costs, the agent, the local transportation, and the hotels can easily double the total amount involved. For instance, let's say you have $5,000 in artist fees. With the extra costs, it could be $10,000 or $12,000. If naturally we can manage to find several concerts, the travel expenses and the visa expenses can be prorated between the presenters so that the asking fee for any one particular presenter is actually lower than if, obviously, they went only to one presenter. So that mostly, in order to make a tour even have a chance to happen, we really need to find at least 3 concerts and have an asking price that's within the budget of the presenters that we're approaching. Now, what happens in that situation is that I find that, let's say we ask for $14,000 and the presenter says, well, we can only give you $10,000. There is not much room to negotiate with U.S. presenters. It's not a wheeling and dealing Moroccan rug sale where, you know, you quote them a huge amount and then you go back and forth. That rarely happens, and in fact, it's that style of approach is not particularly appreciated by presenters. If you put pressure on them to come up with more money, most likely they will say, well, I have somebody else who's ready to go, and you can take my offer or not take my offer, but that's the offer. There can be slight differences. You might be able to negotiate an extra hotel night, something small like that, or local transportation, but getting a significant higher fee from a presenter after they've quoted a fee almost never happens. And it's just the reality of how the U.S. works. It seems that the presenters really do not have the kind of wealth that you would expect in the U.S. They have a very precise amount of money that they can afford for a concert, and I am often in an awkward position because the fees are often so low that artists not only are disappointed, but sometimes they're insulted. They said, how can you possibly want us for such a small fee? So you have to get past that and somehow come to terms with the situation. And let's assume we do and sign and have offers from, let's say, 3 different presenters. And we're going to contract. The kinds of contracts that you will be presented with are, in most cases, very similar to the kinds of contracts that you have in France. They're almost without exception in US dollars, or in Canada in Canadian dollars, meaning that the risk of a currency change during the time you make the contract and the time where you're actually paid for the performance, the artist has to take on the risk of the currency moving in the wrong direction. This is something I've struggled with US presenters, and some artists have insisted that there be some sort of insurance. What happens if there's a tremendous change in the currency exchange rate? It possibly could come under the force majeure clause in the contract as an unavoidable act of God that would cause the artist to have to cancel because he's just not going to receive the money that he expected when he made the contract. Now, that's never happened to me, where the currency has changed that drastically. But a few times I've negotiated a large fee, let's say a fee of $200,000. That would be for an orchestra with a choir and soloists, where a change in the currency could make quite a difference. In those cases, I've seen the artist himself go to their bank and make some kind of arrangement where they can manage to buy some sort of insurance against currency loss. It's usually not worth doing unless it's a large amount of money. But if it's a small amount of money, $10,000, $15,000, and all of a sudden you're faced with receiving $1,000 less, it's like nobody wants to lose $1,000. So it's something that can be handled on a small scale without going to a bank by perhaps adding a small percent to the asking price to cover currency fluctuation, meaning you might add 5% to the asking price as insurance against the currency risk. The contracts, like I said, are in general pretty similar to what you'd expect. I've run into some problems, however, in the question of insurance, because it seems that particularly French groups who have an arrangement with their own insurance company needs a certain kind of a statement from the presenter that the presenter has insurance also. And the French group is asking for a certain kind of wording, a statement in the contract that says the presenter has the proper insurance. Now, most the presenters that I work with don't like to change this part of their contract. They usually, especially if it's a university, it's extremely complex for them to change anything in a contract because it's not the music department, it's the legal department, it's financial people. But again, I haven't come across any situations where that has killed an engagement. We've usually managed to find some kind of wording, very general. Usually the presenter will agree to say, well, we have insurance, without specifying it. And I've seen then the French group have to go back to their insurance company and make sure it's okay, and it seems to have worked, but I just mention this because it's come up more than a few times. Now, I think basically the contracts, like I said, are going to be familiar, except for the dollars and the insurance issues. Usually, the contract is made with me as the agent for the number of presenters on a tour. I receive all the money from each presenter, and then I have a contract with the artist that's a summary of all their engagements. And when I receive the payments, I usually wire US dollars to the artist in one lump sum, representing all the fees from all the different presenters. And then I send them an invoice for my commission and subtract my commission from the money I wire them. In rare cases, presenters will pay the artist directly, but that involves some complications with taxes. And I will move into the tax situation right now because it's one that seems to be very confusing to artists. The first part of the situation with the taxes is that anybody who pays a foreign artist a fee, it could be the presenter or it could be myself, the agent, has to, by law, withhold, keep aside, put aside 30% of the fee. The reason for that is that the government assumes that if you work in the United States, you have to pay income tax on the amount of money you earned. And since it's a foreign entity, as insurance, they like to take the money in advance and give it back to you if you don't owe any taxes. But if you do owe taxes, well, they have the money already. Now, that might sound scary. It is scary because none of these tours can really afford to lose 30% of the fee. And fortunately, there's some ways around this. It's possible for an ensemble or an individual artist to receive an exemption from withholding tax, meaning that if they fill out some forms, it's very easy for a company to fill out a form. They usually submit this form to the presenter, not to the US government, and it simply exempts the company from owing federal income tax, and therefore the presenter does not have to withhold 30%. I saw an email from an Italian administrator writing to a US presenter and quoting her the terms, and in the terms she wanted the presenter to pay their taxes. That's a completely incorrect approach. The first place, the presenter would never pay the taxes as part of the fee. The taxes are the responsibility of the artist. Thanks to the exemptions, which are usually based on tax treaties between the US and a foreign country. It's not usually an issue in Europe. France, Germany, Italy all have this tax treaty with the United States so that they can receive an exemption. Individuals can also receive an exemption. Let's say just a pianist is going to perform, or it gets complicated sometimes. I've toured a group that has a name, but it's not incorporated as a company. So in the eyes of the government, the US government, it's actually looking at 4 or 5 individuals. The company, there is no company, so the company cannot get an exemption, and each individual artist has to get an exemption. Now, in the process of getting these exemptions, whether it's a company or as an individual, they need to get what's called a federal ID number, which is an identification number that essentially puts you on the books of the U.S. government. They know who you are because they have a number attached to you. And in the case of a company, getting a ID number is just a phone call. You could do it on the phone, you can do it from France, I can do it for you. It's a very, very simple thing. In the case of an individual, it's not a simple thing, because they say that in order to get an ID number or a social security number, you actually have to apply in the U.S. while you're in the U.S. to an office in the U.S. and receive the number that way. Now, most artists don't have the time to go to an office and wait and wait and wait to receive this number. So it's always a problem with individuals. It's a million times easier to do this with a company because it's literally just a phone call. The other thing that can happen with the taxes is if there is no exemption and they do withhold 30%, it doesn't mean you're going to lose the 30%. What happens is that at the end of the tax fiscal year, which let's say if you had a concert in August 2014, at the end of the year 2014, you could file an income tax report with the U.S. government showing your income versus your expenses. And normally your expenses would be greater than your income, and you would have no taxable income, no tax. But they already kept the 30%. Well, they would refund the 30% after you file this report. Now, nobody likes to do this because you don't want to wait 6 months, you don't want to chase money, you don't want to have to go through all this paperwork. But it is doable. The bottom line is almost no foreign artists ever pay any taxes. They might have the tax withheld before they're paid, but they can get it back through the mechanism I just described. Is that clear? Because it's pretty complicated, the idea of withholding and being exempt and filing taxes. Is that pretty clear to everybody? Yes?
Just a question, does the ID number, fiscal ID number, last all lifelong for a company?
Once you have it, you have it. Now, there's an added complication to this that in practice is not followed, but it's technically the legal responsibility of the company or the artist. Let's say a company has an exemption and gets its entire fee, no withholding taxes. When it pays its artists at home, the company is supposed to withhold 30%. And the artist himself is supposed to file an income tax report based on the income he earned while he was in the U.S. And the income is defined as any kind of income, whether it's a salary, like the individual is an employee, or is an independent contractor, or he even gets hotel and local transportation. That's counted as income. Now, I said that in practice, nobody does this. I have not worked with one company who withheld 30% when they paid their artists, when they got home, and I don't know of any artists who've ever filed income tax reports. Technically, they're supposed to. If you talk to a lawyer a tax lawyer who specializes in performers, of course they'll tell you what's legal and what should be done. If I talk to my own accountant, he'll say, well, don't really worry about it because there's no taxes due, so there's no penalty. The only real danger is if you have taxes are due and don't pay them, then there's penalties, and they could become serious. But there's almost never any taxes due because the expenses are always greater than the income. There's also, for individuals, there's a minimum exemption if you don't earn taxable income. That's income minus the expenses. The taxable income is less than $4,000 or $5,000. It changes. It gets a little higher every year. You're not required to file taxes, and you certainly are not required to pay taxes. So like I say, that part of it is a little more complicated and mysterious because it's not something artists usually do, but they're supposed to do it. The other possible consequence that the lawyers will tell you is that at some point the United States will combine the visa department and the tax department. And you might not at some point be able to get a visa if you are not compliant with the tax situation. This would be a complete nightmare if this ever happens, because...
Just say, could you really speak straight to the microphone?
You're still having trouble hearing me, sorry. This connection between the visa department and the tax, it doesn't seem to be happening too fast, but I noticed that it's mentioned by lawyers that it could happen. For the moment, I usually explain this to the artists, and it's their responsibility to make a decision on what to do. It's not a simple thing to have 35 artists, let's say if it's a chamber orchestra, each file income tax report in a foreign country where they don't know anything about how it works. So somebody has to be paid usually to prepare their income tax reports. And chances are that's the reason why it's not done. I'm not a tax lawyer. I use and have consulted one on occasion to find out the details like this. But they often will say it's a very case-by-case situation, and that if anyone really has a question, they should consult a specialist. The only other area where taxes could be an issue is where you have a vedette, a star performer, who makes a lot of money in the U.S. and their income is above the minimum amount, and they also might be performing with other groups or have other engagements in the U.S., so that their total income during that year could be something that is taxable. And in that case, that kind of a person, usually let's say a famous singer or a famous violinist, would probably have their own accountant, and they would handle their tax situation. I'm going to move on to visas, unless anybody has another question about the taxes. Yes, two people.
On a very practical level, I'd just like to know if you could give us one or two names of tax lawyers that could be advised in case of people wanting information.
Yeah, well, there's one team who are the absolute specialists in the U.S. in both taxes and visas. The name is Brian Goldstein, and they have a website which explains both taxes and visas called artistsfromabroad.com. These are lawyers who go to conferences and give lectures about these situations. They'll meet with you for 15 minutes for free. You can usually get a consultation, the first consultation for free. They've helped me out in a couple of very tight visa situations. A couple of times they've had contacts at the airports. Somebody was having trouble at the last minute. There are other ones, but I would start with these particular people. I think they're, without question, the top and best informed.
And I just have a few technical questions in regards to what you said, just to make sure I understood everything. When it comes to the minimum amount under which you are exempt beforehand, you said $4,000 to $5,000 and saying that it was increasing every year. But I thought in the tax treaty between the U.S. and France, there was an amount that was written of $20,000 or $15,000. So,
yeah, that's I think two separate things. When I was talking about $3,000 to $4,000, I was talking about an individual tax return for one person. I think when the tax treaty, and it's a good question. I'm not quite sure what, because I haven't, you know, when we fill out, the form is called the W-8-B-E-N, and in it you refer to Article 7, which is the article about the tax treaty, and it has never been an issue. We send this to the presenters. It's signed by the artist, and it's not submitted to the government. It's just kept on file by the presenter in case they need it, in case the government asks them. But it's never been an issue one way or the other. If they sign it and they're a legitimate company that's incorporated in their home country, seems to work just fine.
and just last question to make sure I understood it right. When you said that a group of 4 to 5 people was considered not as a group, as a company, but as individuals, is that a rule that chamber ensembles should know about? Is there, because in Germany there is this minimum number of artists under which the group, even though there is a company, is no longer considered as a group. So is that the case?
Not quite by the number. It gets quite complex. For instance, if you take a string quartet, if there's a distinction made between whether the members of the company are profit sharers, do they share equally in the profits? If they do, that puts them in another case where it's not so simple. If they're employees that are receiving fees for their work, and the company is keeping some money also, then it's eligible for this exemption. When you get into this profit sharing, and it's not only string quartets are the more obvious, because often there's not a administration even, and there's just 4 people who look like maybe they are just sharing the whole profits. But it also could happen in some of these self-governing orchestras, where, for instance, in Germany, Concerto Kern, with whom I work, there's a question of whether their core members are actually profit-sharing members. Are they sharing the profits, or are they just getting a fee for performing when they go on tour? We resolved that by saying that they're not profit-sharing, and that they're all just equally the same, and they have the exemption. Now, I'm not sure if that's absolutely true, if it was ever taken to court, but for our purposes, it seems to be okay at the moment. Was there another question next to you?
Yes, I have 2 questions concerning the W-8-EBN form. A German limited company, limited responsibility company, is it rather a corporation or a foundation in this form?
I don't think it matters what it is. the only distinction I know that does matter is if the company is non-profit in its own country,
Yeah.
it's another form of exemption that it can receive in the United States, apart from the treaty. But the only catch, if you want to call it that, is that you won't be automatically recognized in the United States as a nonprofit corporation just because you are a nonprofit corporation in Germany. The way to deal with that is you can file a form with the U.S. government asking them to recognize you as a nonprofit corporation, or you can hire a lawyer in the U.S. who will vouch for you. In other words, they will believe what the lawyer says because he's reviewed your situation, and as far as he can see, you would be eligible to be a nonprofit organization in the U.S., and he submits an application on your behalf. And of course, using a lawyer costs money. So if you can get a W-8BEN form by just a phone call, it's easier than hiring a lawyer to deal with your nonprofit status. I should also say these W-8BEN forms are good. They don't have to be renewed. It's, you know, I just keep submitting the same one that was signed 4 years ago. The only thing that came back once, they couldn't read the signature, and I had to get somebody to print their name. So it's very easy to use, really.
And this famous phone call to obtain the ID number, I can make it to who?
Yes, yeah. You can find that online, or I could look it up for you and give you the information. But I've done it a few times. It's very easy. You get somebody on the phone who's really a bureaucrat. They don't really know much about too much. And you tell them what you want, and they make you wait 2 minutes, and then they give you a number. It's very simple.
Thank you.
Okay, so I guess we're ready to move on to visas. Firstly, the main idea we all have to accept is that anyone working in the United States needs a visa. And there are two types in general of visas. There are visas for the performers, and there are visas for the support team. Support team basically is defined as anybody who's not performing, which would include a tour manager, a general manager, a technician, a lighting technician, a sound technician, anyone in that kind of category. Now, each of these types of visas require their own application. One's called a support application, the other one is the artist application. Normally, I've done my own visa applications on behalf of artists and have found that it's very time-consuming and sort of annoying. It's a lot of material that has to be organized. And in the past 4 or 5 years, I've been using a visa service, a US-based person who specializes in filing visa applications. The charge for that is roughly $1,700 to $2,000 per application. Now, keep in mind, and this is difficult for foreign artists sometimes to accept, that the use of a support team, the idea of bringing 3 people on a tour with 10 people, 10 artists, is already doubling the cost of the visas because you need 2 applications, one for the performer and one for the support team. In the case where you have, let's say, 10 or 15 musicians touring and one general manager, they always say, well, why do I need a visa? You know, it's It's crazy just for one person. I'll go as a tourist. Well, that can work, but you can't be too obvious. Like, if you have a general manager traveling with a group on the same plane, arriving in the same airport, getting on the same line with a bunch of people with instrument cases, I wouldn't recommend it. The penalties for trying to get into the United States under false pretenses is 10 years. 10 years, you can't come back. So it's not a risk that really anybody wants to take. If the general manager or the one person traveling, or even if it's two people, can manage to change their itineraries so they arrive at a different airport or a different day, a day earlier, and say they're just going to New York as a tourist, that could work. But you have to be very careful. Don't ever go as a group with somebody who doesn't have a visa. Now, there are two parts to actually obtaining a visa. What is a visa, finally? It's what's stamped in the passport, giving you the right to enter into the United States and work there. So on the one hand, there is an application filed in the United States, which costs between $1,700 and $2,000. That application is essentially a legal document proving that the artist is an artist, number one, and that he has verifiable engagements in the United States. And artists have never done this before. They can't believe what's required, and they say, oh my God, how did we ever get into this? This is crazy. They'll have to provide scans of every passport. They'll have to prove that the members that they say are in the group actually are in the group. How do they prove that? You have to show copies of programs where the lists of the names of the performers are, to show that the performer actually plays with this group. Other categories or types of things that are required, there are a few different categories of visas. One, for instance, is the artist is internationally renowned. He's famous. Well, what does that mean in terms of the U.S. government? International means you performed in more than your own country. So most French and German groups have performed in many countries in Europe, and that's satisfactory to prove that you're internationally famous. However, the paperwork involved, you again have to provide posters, programs, all the documentation that proves what you're saying. That's why I use the phrase, it's a bit like a legal document. It's a legal argument proving what you're saying, that this is an artist who has these engagements. Now, to prove you have the engagements, you have to provide copies of the contracts that you have in the U.S. And you're usually allowed a 5-day period to arrive before the first concert and a 5-day period after the last concert. Extending the stay because you want to be a tourist for a week can be done, but it's complex. And normally it's not something that anybody does. It's really very much rooted in the exact contracts you have, and becomes an issue sometimes because the visa applications need to be submitted rather early because it's a long process, and sometimes you might not even have a contract yet from the presenter, a signed contract. You can get a letter of intent from the presenter. And actually what I do is, if I don't have a contract yet, I use the visa situations as an excuse to push the presenter. I said, look, we gotta apply, you gotta submit our application. We need the contract, now. And It's a good way to confirm everything rather than waiting and who knows what could happen. So it's kind of a useful thing at that point. The other side, I've described the application that's submitted in the United States, and it's submitted by a US-based person. It can be either a service, like I've mentioned, and in some cases it can be the actual presenter who will, as part of the terms of the contract, submit the application on behalf of the artist. There are only a few places that are willing to do this. They're usually the bigger presenters. Carnegie Hall will do it. The Walt Disney Hall in LA will do it. Lincoln Center prefers not to do it. Boston Early Music Festival will do it for its festival in June, but not necessarily during its regular season. So it's a bit of, there's no clear rule. You're lucky if you can have a presenter agree to do it, because they usually will pay the application fees and do all the labor and make sure they get all the supporting material from the artist. Okay, so there's that section. Then on the other side of the ocean, there's still the question of how do you get the visa stamped in your passport? Well, what happens is after the application in the US goes through its process, a notice of approval is issued if everything goes well, meaning that from the government's point of view, everything looks in order, and they're willing to give the artist a visa. But that isn't the end of the process. Then the artist in his local country needs to go to an American consulate or embassy and actually drop off their passport with a self-addressed envelope and leave it there until it's stamped with the passport, with the visa. Until they leave their passport until it's stamped with the visa. Then the passport is mailed back, hopefully express mail, to the artist, at which point he has his passport and his visa. That is still not the absolute guarantee of entry into the United States. You could still be denied entry when you arrive or when you're getting on the airplane, for whatever reason. They don't like the way you look, even. They don't have to give a reason. This has never happened to me before, but it is a technicality that when you arrive at JFK in New York, the immigration officer can still deny you entry, even if you have a visa. So behave, be respectful, don't do anything crazy throughout the entire process. Some artists, they're frustrated, they don't know why they have to go through all this, they lose their tempers. It's really not a good idea at any part of the process, because these are authorities, they're not very sophisticated people, and you basically hold your breath, smile, and hope for the best, and go through. The cost of getting the visa stamped into your passport is unfortunately a significant cost in the overall budget of a tour, because it's at least 200 euros per person. So if you have 10 people traveling, that's already 2,000 euros extra that you're, plus the 2,000 US that you're paying for the application. So you could end up having a visa cost of between $4,000 to $5,000. It doesn't matter how many people, well, it matters how many people are traveling when you have a $200 per person cost to go to the embassy. When you make the application, it could have 35 people on it. It doesn't make any difference in the cost. The only cost in terms of numbers happens in Europe when you go to the consulates or the embassies. Now, that aspect of, well, The scheduling of the entire visa process is something that has to be very carefully attended to. Because how many artists can leave their passport for how long at any particular moment in their professional career? And if you wait too long, especially to the last minute, and all of a sudden you only have 2 weeks before you're leaving, to leave your passport at an embassy and hope that it comes back in time, and maybe you have to go to Brazil or something, you're going to have problems. So the answer to this problem is everything has to be done in advance. The visa application should be begun absolutely as soon as possible, even before, as I said, the contracts are signed. And you can even use the visa situation to get the contracts signed. Because you'll have to wait. I mean, it used to be a lot longer. It could be 4 to 5 months before you got an answer about the application. Now it's a little quicker. It's maybe a month to 6 weeks. But let's say you get your notice of approval, then you have to start the process of scheduling the visit to the embassy or the consulate. Now, they don't necessarily see you anytime you happen to be available. They have their own schedule. So that is why it needs to be done as soon as possible so that the artists can fit their own traveling schedule and their own professional life into the available interview dates that are going to be offered by the American embassy or consulate. Now, an artist can go to an American consulate or embassy in any country. They have a global electronic system where all the embassies are supposed to be aware that the ensemble has received a notice of approval. A notice of approval will list all the names of the people that are approved for a visa. Every one of those people has to schedule an interview, pay the $200, bring with them a photograph and a self-addressed envelope, and make a schedule that they can live with, that's not too close to the time of departure. The worst case I've ever had was somebody who actually took a taxi to the FedEx building next to the airport and insisted that they find his package, which had been mailed back to him, managed to get it, and drove immediately to the airport with his visa. I mean, that was about as last minute as ever happened. In Italy, I had a situation where a passport was mailed back to somebody and it disappeared. I mean, they refused to use express mail in Italy at that time, or that particular embassy, and they had to rush like crazy to get a duplicate passport and get the visas, you know, use their connections and friends at the embassy. Nightmare to get the thing finally on time. So for all these reasons, start early. That's basically the main lesson. Now, any questions about the visas?
Is it limited time for this type of visa for musicians?
Well, it's limited to the period of time of the tour.
It's not like you get for 5 years.
No, not at all. If, for instance, and I've seen this happen, one group has a tour in October, and it's coming back with a slightly different group in April. It's possible to make one visa application for the 2 tours, even if it's not exactly the same personnel. You simply put all of the personnel needed on the one application, and some of them show up when they need to, and some of them show up at the other date. But it's not, if you look at any visa information online, you will see possibilities that might attract you because they look easier. But they really don't apply to artists working. There are some distinctions when an artist performs in a venue where they don't sell tickets. In other words, it's a free concert. That's not quite considered work, even if the artist is, what they would be paid is what's called an honorarium. You know, just some gesture of a payment. And they might be able to go through in a simplified category, but for the most part, all the artists will be dealing with a real visa for people who work in the United States. Anything else? Okay. The next subject about managing a tour in the U.S. Is a new problem. We thought that the visas and the tax situation were already enough, but there's now the issue of protected materials that are in instruments. The Obama administration decided last spring to enforce restrictions that were already laws, but nobody had decided to enforce them. And what these laws have to do with importing certain types of materials that are on lists of protected species. The most obvious one is African ivory. Now, why would that be important to musicians? Well, it turns out that violin bows in the frog, that little circle, can often be African ivory. And believe it or not, that little piece of ivory can be a serious problem at this point. If it's not properly documented, the instrument could be confiscated at the border when you enter into the United States. Now, it's not only ivory. There is a list of materials that may or may not be in instruments. The other types of materials are tortoise shell. There are certain kinds of Brazilian wood that is protected. Now, I am in the process of doing this for the first time with a group that's touring in April. So I know less about how this works than these other things. But from what I understand, and I've talked to Lincoln Center's technical director and Walt Disney's technical director about how they've handling it, because there's already been problems in New York. The Berlin Philharmonic was just in New York, and they had some problems with their bows at the what we call the port of entry. The general idea is that the ensemble or the artist, first of all, they need to make an inventory of their instruments and what materials are in them and when they were purchased and when they were built. All these things affect the ability to import, that's what's called import into the U.S., the instrument. Now, there's a worldwide organization called CITES. Some of you might have heard of it. Every country has its own office of CITES. And apparently in Europe, this idea of traveling around with protected species is not new at all. It's been around for years. How do you spell it? CITES. And the general idea is that after this inventory of the instruments and their materials, purchase date, production date is put together, it'll be clearer which instruments might be problematic. And those instruments need to be inspected by a CITES office who will confirm what materials are in it and issue a permit to travel with the instrument. But that's not the end of it. There is only, at the moment, a few designated ports of entry in the United States where the instrument has to be inspected by an American inspector. And if that isn't complicated, there's two inspectors, one for plant and one for animal material. So ivory is an animal and wood is a plant. I'm told that the best way to handle this is to contact the inspector's office in advance and make sure that they know the orchestra is coming and that they are there at the airport when the orchestra arrives. Because if they don't come to the airport, the musician has to go to their office, which could be a 30-minute drive from the airport, which nobody wants to do. You know, everybody, after the transatlantic flight, they want to get out of the airport as fast as possible and go to their hotel. So the general idea is a bit like the visas. The sooner you tackle and look into all this and try to organize all your papers and the inspection on entry into the United States, the more likely it is to be an efficient process that presents less problems. I wish I could tell you a little more about that, but as I said, I'm just doing the first tour where it is an issue. And so far, we have made an inventory of the instruments. It's a group of 22 musicians. And it seems to be the problem they're going to have is with a mandolin, which has tortoise shell and decorations all over it. And we'll be trying to get a permit from the CITES office so that when they arrive in they're arriving in LA is one of the designated ports of entry. They won't presumably have any trouble. We hope. I mean, it has happened already that I think it was a Hungarian orchestra who had engagement at Lincoln Center in the spring where they confiscated the bows. The Lincoln Center went all over town looking for bows to lend to the musicians to play in the performance. The bows were given back to the musicians when they left the United States. I mean, I've heard of problems, but I haven't heard of an instrument being taken permanently. It might be confiscated temporarily and given back when the artist leaves. So you're not really facing the loss of the whole instrument, but of course nobody likes to play on a borrowed instrument when they're in an important engagement. This also applies, just if it's any consolation, to American musicians. If the New York Philharmonic were to go on tour in China, when they come back to the US, they would face the same problems. So the general feeling is that the US government has made this enormous mistake by overlooking the effect of this law on musicians. So what we have now in the US are some major organizations like the American Federation of Musicians, the union. There's also a League of American Orchestras who are actively lobbying the US government to change these policies or to make them more flexible. The general idea is that they hope that an instrument will finally be able to have a passport, and the passport will be good forever, and people can travel freely by showing this passport. Unfortunately, at the moment, it's not so simple, but there is an effort to solve the problem. Any questions about that?
On the subject as well, that's called Pearl.
Pearl?
Pearl, yeah. It's a performing arts organization in Brussels, and it gathers many unions and federations. And so, like, I work myself for a French Federation of Ensembles, so we're part of this Pearl organization. And what they have done is that they have made available a few documents that are helping the musicians to figure out what in their instruments could be of a problem, so that you don't have to go on the city's website and check all these technical, scientific names of things that you have never heard of, and so that you can check what can actually be applied to your instrument. So we're definitely trying to work on giving more information.
I've looked at the CITES website myself, and it is so technical. I mean, there's lists and lists and lists of materials. You wouldn't even know what they are.
With Latin names and things
Yeah,
like that.
I mean,
so I
it's-
think we have this document that shows, oh, this could be in a bow, this could be in this instrument. It's a first start, but then there's also a lot of other...
If you Google Ivory and American orchestras, you will find this website of the American Orchestra League, which is trying to keep everybody informed about the news about this, and lists of trying to make it simple for musicians to understand. But it isn't, and I've written directly to them with a bunch of questions, and they tried to answer, and you know, the more questions you ask, the more complicated it gets. So it really is, I mean, visas seem like a piece of cake at this point compared to the instrument problem. But orchestras, I've asked a few presenters, has any orchestra canceled an engagement because of this issue? And nobody has. They all plug away and are trying to do it. And we're talking major orchestras like the Berlin Philharmonic and so on.
Does this whole process has a cost?
Oh, of course.
What is it?
I think it costs the CITES permit and examination costs, I don't know what it costs, but it does cost money. And then on the other side, in the U.S., there are some permits that you need to acquire also to not so much get into the country, but get out of the country. I don't think they're significant. They're not thousands of dollars, but it could be $50, $75 an instrument. Just another thing I can tell you that I learned, that for a large orchestra, there is a way to put all the bows, for instance, all the suspect instruments in one container and put it in the cargo, and the container itself is somehow receives a permit and the whole thing goes through. But with smaller groups, a string quartet or a group of 15, mostly the musicians will be hand carrying their instrument, in which case they'll have to be individually inspected. When I find out a little more about this, maybe it's possible that even a string quartet could put some of their instruments in cargo. I don't think any of them like to do that, but...
But you think the cargo will have less issues?
Yeah, they're supposed to have less issues.
At least the company takes care of it.
And also, it's easy to inspect everything at once, because it's all in one place, apparently. And the American League of Orchestra, they're the ones who suggested that to me. But for my purposes, since I'm not dealing with symphony orchestras, it's not exactly a useful solution.
Excuse me, I just have another question to make sure I understood it right. When you said there's an inspection,
Yes.
there's an inspection at the port of entry in the U.S. Is there an inspection at an office abroad beforehand, or is it just on the ground, on the U.S. ground? Like when you find out that you have a bow?
I think if you're in France or Germany, you need to have the suspect instruments inspected in the local country. And then when you get to the United States, in one of these designated ports of entry, because it's not any airport. Right now it's JFK and Newark, San Francisco and LA, maybe Atlanta. Then it's inspected again by the US side to sort of confirm that what you have is valid, that they believe it, you know. Now, there are other aspects of managing a tour which I think are fairly straightforward, but I can just talk a little bit about how I handle things or how different artists do. For instance, the local travel and the international travel. The international travel, I have a travel agent in New York who specializes in musicians traveling, who can handle airfare and hotels, and they're especially good at finding hotels that are of a certain level. I think if you go online, and this has happened, where artists say, well, I found this place on 8th Avenue in New York, it's half the price of your agent. But then if you ask the agent about that hotel, she says, I wouldn't put a musician there. It's not safe, it's not clean, there's no Wi-Fi. So I don't ever insist that anybody use my agent, travel agent. Often artists have their own travel agents who they have worked with all over the world. That's fine with me. Where they more likely need my help is in arranging the local transportation, airport pickups, explaining the best way to go from the venue to the hotel. And these things aren't particularly complicated, but they're part of what I see as my job, to make sure the artist is comfortable and everything works efficiently and there's no disasters or surprises about money. So usually these things are worked out well in advance, what the costs are, how many taxis might be needed, if you need to rent a van, and so on. Some cases, especially more on the West Coast than the East Coast, as part of the terms of the presenter, the local transportation will be provided. So we don't have to worry about it. The presenter arranges to have whatever's needed, pick you up at the airport, bring you to the hotel, take you from the hotel to the venue, and so on. So I've covered, what have I covered? The contracts, US dollars, the visas, the taxes, the protected species, and the travel. Anything else that you can think of that worries you about touring in the US?
Is there any website of recommended presenters in the US?
The website of what?
Of the presenters in the US? Of
What?
the presenters in the US?
Yes. You mean, what about the websites, or?
I'm asking about the list of American presenters. Is it available on the website?
Oh, well, not on one website. Well, there's a directory called Musical America. Do you know about that? As I mentioned earlier this morning, that there were 70 pages of just presenting series, and there's another 30 pages of festivals. What's difficult about using that kind of directory is that they will show a great number of activities, and what I assume we're all looking for are classical music outlets, maybe jazz, but you have to read them very carefully to see which ones might be useless to approach. And one way is what I have to do is, I get the name of a presenter, let's say in Arizona, University of Arizona has a big performing arts series. I just go to that particular website and look at who they're presenting. And if I see that it's all pop music and Andrea Botticelli or somebody, I don't think it's going to work. So I cross them off the list. I have about 500 names, contacts on my database. And my database is specific to early music. So there's probably more, depending on what you're doing. But there really is not one place to get a custom-made list of presenter websites. Musical America has deals where you can buy a mailing list, for instance, of all the music schools or all the festivals, if you like. But again, you'll have the same problem of finding the match between what you're doing and what they're doing. The more sneaky way to do this, you want to call it that, is to look at one of your competitors or two or three of your competitors and see where they're performing. And that's really one of the easiest ways to find a list that's relevant to what you're doing. What sort of group do you work with?
Me?
Yeah.
No, I'm not representing any group. I'm just interested.
Okay.
I'm just interested how it's organized in the US.
And just so we'll have to leave the hall like in 5 minutes.
Okay.
Just would like to add that on the Bureau Export we have also a database, and we did like a huge work on listing presenters, mostly on East Coast. So it can be, I think, a good start to check our website.
No, maybe I'll take a look at that too.
So, do you recommend not to bring musicians to America?
Well, actually, my last point was, what is the future? What's the point? And one of the questions I always ask an artist when they come to me to represent, I said, why do you want to go to the United States? Look how hard it is, all these problems, and you have to almost always find subsidies. Well, the answer is really an individual calculation for each ensemble, because what they can gain from the United States is international exposure, international reputation. If their tours are successful, they are internationally better known than they were before. It's an important market. It's got a lot of exposure. But it's a calculation that I can't make for the artists. And I've seen it work both ways, where I've arranged a tour. I've gotten a re-engagement of a tour for a group. And then finally they say, oh, we don't really need this. We're so busy in Europe, and it's too costly, and the visa's too much pain in the neck, we're not going to do it. But on the other hand, I have groups that they just love going to the United States. They like the audiences, they like the response, they like being in a new country. And more importantly, they think it's important to their profile to be internationally famous. And you can't be international unless you travel and tour around. So mostly it's really kind of an investment. It's certainly not a money-making proposition. To me, it's like a promotional investment for a group. It can help their reputation. It can help them maybe even raise money at home if they've been to the U.S. and are very successful. If they've been to Lincoln Center 4 times in a row, they can go home and say, wow, look at us, we're famous, we're doing really well, we need your help, we want to be more famous. And so that is the calculus that goes on, or the dilemma that every artist is faced when they're looking at these asking fees, which are almost without exception a little lower or a lot lower than the actual cost of doing the tour. So I don't want to end on a completely pessimistic note. People love going to the U.S. They have a great time. They have very open, enthusiastic audiences. They're very emotive and standing ovations. People get good reviews. They make everybody happy, and they get invited back. So the ones that can do it and can find the money and work it out with their global strategy, it's very good for them. It's probably a good thing to end on. Another question?
It's very quick. It's just about which organizations do you know of that could be founding maybe a partnership between France and the US? I'm saying when a French ensemble travels to the US, you might have help from Institut Français, Bureau Export, but is there any organization in the US that promotes partnerships between these two countries, or what sort of additional founding do you think?
I've heard that the Annenberg Foundation helped Les Talents Lyriques,
Florence Gould.
but I don't know of any others offhand. You mean an American corporation that's interested in an exchange or bring?
In your experience, there has been other types of financial partners in touring in the US?
No, not American ones. There is a French office in New York that's been very helpful in the past when Emmanuel Morlaix was there. And he was there quite a while. He seemed to have a budget that was separate from Institut Français, for instance, and sometimes could offer some money. And the Maison Français, I think, in Washington, doesn't have particular money, but they will host a concert, which if you need 3 concerts to get a grant, it's useful to have another opportunity to give a concert. This whole subject of fundraising or sponsorship by Americans is probably for another conference, because William Christie, is the prime example of somebody who has American friends of William Christie. And when he goes to New York, he's able to raise money for his activities in France. But of course, he's an American and he thinks like a corporate person when he wants to. And it's not a model that's too comfortable or normal, I think, for most foreign artists.
And is it easier to handle all this stuff in Canada than in the US?
The visas and taxes are much easier in Canada. Yeah, much easier. You don't have to go for interviews and get your passport stamped. I think you just fill out a few papers. You get a tax waiver by filling out some forms. Usually the presenter will help you do that. You don't need a lawyer.
And you don't need a visa for
No,
French artists.
no. So it is much easier. The problem with the Canadian market is there's less money in the Canadian market than the U.S. market. So I've had much less bookings in Canada than in the U.S., unfortunately. But that's the way it is. And you have this problem with the exchange. Right now, the dollar is stronger than it's been for a while. But when I started this 10 years ago, the dollar was about 1.18 per euro. So for 1 euro, you got $1.18. Or you needed $1.18 to pay a euro. Then for many years, it was around 1.35, which is significant. It's 30% difference, 30% extra on top of the euro cost. Right now, it's a little better. It's down to 1.25. But the Canadian dollar is very weak now. It's weak compared to the US dollar. It's about 10% off, and it used to be at par. So all this means is that in order to, if somebody says I need 10,000 euros to get that amount from Canada or the United States, can depend quite a bit on the exchange rate at that particular moment. And Canada right now would be suffering because it has a weak dollar against the euro. So you need that much more Canadian dollars to match a euro fee, and the Canadians don't have that extra money to pay. So that's part of the challenge. You have to be a financier to figure this out sometimes. So how many of you still want to try to tour in the U.S.? Nobody? Oh, okay.
Thank you very much, Stace. I'm really sorry
Thank you.
we have to.
Okay. Thank you.